That was incredible. Thank you so much, Deborah. Could not have dreamed of a better opening remarks in the 3 years I've been thinking about this event. So for our first discussion of many, we're going to start with one of the most challenging and most important aspects of this work, which is how to get police on board. Policing can and should exist without pretextual stops, but a lot of the times when we're advocating for this world, we have trouble articulating what exactly that looks like. So I'm thrilled that law enforcement leaders from across the country who have done this and who have brought their officers on board are here with us to help shape a new narrative around policing without pretext stops. So thrilled to turn it over to my friend Chris Burbank, Prosecuting Attorney John Choi, and Jose Torres from AAA, and Sheriff Alyshia Dyer. There you are. Thank you, guys.
Okay, well, they come up and take their seats. I'm going to start out. I'm Chris Burbank, and there's two things that I think you need to take away from this or be involved in. And the first one is, I am in a room of friends, right? There are people in this room that I have known for years that have never sat in the same room with, which is a privilege, but also people that I've known forever working on some of the same issues. So what I want you to think about, right, is when I first started down the road of immigration and saying, hey, wait a minute, officers should not be immigration enforcement, Sheriff Joe Arpaia called me in the New York Times a radical anarchist and that I should just be disregarded. And so when the Times called, I said, well, I'm a police chief in Utah. Enough said. How do you influence the police chief in Utah? How all do you move beyond this room and get other people to buy into what we're talking about? And secondly, and probably the most important thing, because this happens all the time, we come to things like this, and you may or may not agree with what's being said. Especially if you disagree, you need to say, hey, wait a minute, I disagree. And I know you're talking, right? Talking to a police chief has more ego than anybody but a brain surgeon, except maybe an elected sheriff, right? But we'll let you decide that, right? That's always an inner debate. But we're going to change things up just a little bit because we want your participation. So shoot your hand up. I'm going to be wandering around, so keep your eyes clear because I am a wanderer, as you can see. But we're going to let you ask questions. We're going to talk about things, and I want you to say, okay, yes or no. So I'm going to make sure that I get mostly locations right. So we have John Choi, who's the county attorney from Ramsey County in Minnesota. Thank you for being here, John. Sheriff Alyshia Dyer, Washtenaw County, Michigan. And then we're going to call him an outsider just because we got to poke fun at somebody, right? Jose Torres from AAA. And so we're going to turn it over. We're going to turn it over first to Jose. And why is AAA involved in this?
It's a really great question, and thank you for asking it. Thank you for having me here, first of all. AAA is heavily involved in saving lives, creating member value, and delivering exceptional experiences. One of the things we really take pride in, though, is that saving lives part. And I've only been on AAA for a year, but what I can say is the history of AAA in saving lives is rooted in understanding what the research says about saving lives. And certainly post-Ferguson and looking at post-Floyd, George Floyd's death, AAA sort of looked in the mirror internally to look at its own policies that it was advocating for when it relates to saving lives, and really was proactive in saying, okay, if we're about saving lives, do things like enforcing equipment violation to actually save lives, right? And of course, the research more or less shows that no, when we enforce equipment violations at a high rate, we see no association with a reduction in traffic fatalities. So that was an impetus for us to really say, okay, we need to really say, you know, we need to say, if we're going to save lives, we can't be out here saying, let's push for increased enforcement of equipment violations. So to answer the question, that's what sort of brought us to the table, so to speak, when it relates to this movement to end non-safety stops.
Perfect, thank you. All right, John, this is up to you now, because attorneys are crucial, right? Because a lot of the expectation in policing comes from, well, my county attorney says this is good, or this is the way the DA says we can do business. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here with all of you, and thanks to everybody for just being together around this really important topic. So I was the prosecutor that prosecuted the officer that killed Philando Castile. That happened in July of 2016, and we were not able to get a successful jury verdict, but something stayed with me about that case, which is that Philando had been pulled over so many times. Interestingly, I was the prosecutor that created a diversion program that allowed him to keep his license all those many years so that he could keep driving. But he was pulled over on a pretextual traffic stop. And I used to be a prosecutor that trained police officers that the easiest way to get to probable cause and to have a strong case is that ask for people's consent, and that pretextual traffic stops under the Wren case is perfectly legal, right? But it wasn't until that experience that I recognized that was actually leading to something bad in our community. In fact, it was the worst thing that ever happened in our community. And so I started having these thoughts, did the research, and it was clear to me. I mean, it's ubiquitous. The research that says that the practice of pretextual policing does not work. In fact, the hit rate universally is very low. In fact, if I was a basketball coach and someone shot 2%, it's time to have that conversation about doing another sport, right? And so in 2019, I began that conversation with my police chiefs, and the answer was a resounding no way will we ever do that. But then we had more horrible tragedies in our community. The murder of George Floyd, Dante Wright, all of those things started happening. And I had the opportunity to get my police chiefs on board because I said that I would have a policy that I would not prosecute cases that emanated from a non-public safety traffic stop. So if you pull somebody over because of a broken headlight, my policy says that we would not prosecute that drug case or that gun case that would come to us. I'm so thankful that at least 3 of my police chiefs out of 9, but those were the 3 largest, were with me. I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like if none of them were, because it was truly the most controversial thing that I have ever done in my career. I got so immense pushback, but I knew that the research and the data would set us free. And so 2 years later, we were able to prove and show that actually, indeed, we reduced racial disparities, just like we said, a 66% reduction for black motorists in being pulled over for non-public safety traffic stops. We could see the change where basically equipment violations or non-public safety traffic stops became less than 10% of all traffic stops. And then we were able to build out on an alternative. So when somebody is driving, they observe an equipment violation, they could put it into the system. The next day, we will send a notice out to the individual, whoever owns the vehicle, to tell them that you have this defective equipment violation. And then we actually, if they come down to the police station, we will give them a coupon or a voucher up to $450 to repair whatever the defect is. And so now, today, it's really baked into our system. The data continues to show those promising numbers. But again, it was a collaboration, and it was something that we all did together as a community.
Thank you very much. So why is it that if you are pro-civil rights, pro-constitution, you are anti-policing? interesting to think about that. I always viewed policing as the protector of civil rights, the protector of the Constitution, and that the Fourth Amendment should not be taught as how do you get around the Fourth Amendment so that we can do real police work, but how do you abide and, in fact, enhance that and make sure that everyone's protected, regardless of what they look like, where they might be standing at that moment, or what city they might be in this country. So someone who has taken this on with police officers, which is not an easy thing, or with deputies, right? I got to remember, right? There's a different world between the cops and the sheriffs. No, not really. But please, Sheriff.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Alyshia Dyer. I was elected sheriff actually quite recently last year. And prior to that, I was working at the sheriff's office as a deputy sheriff. Then I ended up becoming a community organizer, going to school for social work. So I had sort of an interesting path to police leadership. And one of the things that I talked about often when I was running was the problem with traffic stops in our community. I was bringing the experience of being an officer on the ground and being really sick and tired of being yelled at for not making enough stops or not writing enough tickets. And so I talked a lot about the mental health and wellness and how, many folks in law enforcement get into it to, protect their community, to respond to serious situations, be there when people need help. They usually did not get into it to make traffic stops and write tickets. And I definitely was not one of them, especially because, I worked in a very under-resourced, underinvested community that I grew up in and saw how the traffic stops were contributing to just a lot of harm, whether causing stress for families or whether people getting warrants because they could not pay the tickets, and then just the cascading effects that were associated with that. So luckily, because of how with sheriffs, it's a little different because we're elected. So typically what you say and what you believe can be more public facing. And so I was lucky that when I got into office, there was this narrative that I was so radical, I was going to take all their guns away. So not doing that, like, they're like, oh, she's not that bad. She's just stopping stops. So as part of it, I learned is they were so, and even though I had worked with some of the officers, because of what they heard on the trail and because of sort of just the politics, they were prepared for the worst. And so when we actually started talking to them about the why behind the policies, and we didn't just connect it to the racism and the systemic violence and classism that's embedded in traffic enforcement, we also talked about how it impacts them, their mental health, their wellness. And most of the officers on the ground were fine. It was actually interesting. It was the middle management that probably I got the most pushback from. And then from our contract partners, because we do contract policing as sheriffs. And so if people can't afford or want to save money by not having their own police force, they will contract for the sheriff's office to work in that jurisdiction. And they had been so used to gauging the value of police work based on tickets and stops. And so when we implemented the traffic stop reform policy in Washtenaw, and it was mirrored after Ann Arbor adopted an ordinance, the traffic stop equality ordinance that was spearheaded by a council member, Cynthia Harrison, that really also helped set the groundwork because we were able to mimic that ordinance in our policy. And our policy basically stopped most of the low-level, non-safety related stops. And then what we saw is a significant decrease. Equipment violation stops went down 70%. Traffic stops across the board, 50%. Arrests from traffic stops have gone down 40%. And then tickets, we have estimated we have saved residents over $1 million. The contract partners, however, they're seeing that often as, well, they're not working anymore. And so the biggest challenge for me, at least, hasn't been the police as much as it's been getting the local townships to understand there's more value to deputies' work outside of the traffic enforcement. It's really about saving lives and also convincing them that if you really care about traffic safety, you need to invest in designing roadways and neighborhoods to be different because that's what's actually going to save lives. And so the work has been pretty rewarding. And then the other quick tip for other agencies that we did is before we implemented the policy, we had sergeants on up involved in the crafting and the drafting. So that way, when we did finally implement it, there were champions at different ranks that could really explain to the officers what it meant and sort of the why behind why it's important that we're doing it.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the first question, then I'm coming to all of you. And as far as the panel, jump in, right? Don't be shy. So when I first looked at jaywalking tickets and found out that we were only writing jaywalking tickets in that neighborhood, and we were only writing tickets to certain people, I said, well, we're not writing jaywalking tickets anymore. Right? This is not going on the University of Utah campus. This is not going on in the East Bench of Salt Lake City. Well, it went on in West Valley. I wasn't responsible for West Valley, but thank goodness. But, Chief, how are we going to catch anybody doing bad things? Right, how are we going to get in their pockets, right? This is the high drug area, Chief. You know that, right? You've worked here before. How are we going to get the criminals if we can't stop them and get in their pockets? Isn't crime going to go through the roof? If you are not, what about the one time driving on I-80 through Salt Lake City that you get the 10 million pounds of cocaine, right? And the trooper puts his foot up on the bags and says, look what I got. What's going to happen? Right? Everybody's going to be on drugs. Respond to that.
Well, I think that what it fails to do, that type of thinking, it fails to think about the 99 people out of 100 and the deterioration of trust that police will experience when they pull somebody over on an equipment violation, and it's clear that maybe it's based upon suspicion, and then there's potentially a search that could be involved, and there's no hit, meaning that they didn't find the contraband. That happens 99, in your example, out of 100 times. And so the deterioration of the trust, and so there's a better way of policing, there's a better way of enforcing the law, and it's what you talked about is that certain things you could say we're not going to do anymore, or there are certain things that we'll do very, very differently.
And I'll just say, you know, this was a myth that many in law enforcement grew up believing, that, you know, you have to make a bunch of stops because you're going to find the next serial killer on the traffic stop. And they embedded it in the police academies. And I think it's just really looking at the data and looking at the research. But also we explained, regardless if you do find a whole bunch of cocaine in a trunk, you cause significant trauma and making these low-level stops and eroded trust for years before even getting to that one situation, if it ever even happens. And then the other reality is, if you really care about safety, making traffic stops when you know that there's a dangerous intersection or a dangerous area is not going to actually solve the problem. And so it's trying to get officers to think more front-end prevention, where just finding a whole bunch of cocaine in a trunk is not solving the drug war. It's just not. And so trying to get them to understand that and see that there's more, better ways to go about looking at some of those issues, I think was helpful for us.
Okay, anyone disagree with that? This is interesting.
I think what I'm hearing from both Mr. Choi and you, Sheriff Dyer, is that we need to change the metrics of how we evaluate policing, right? And I think that for too long, we turn and burn, and we think that's what makes good cops. So how do we change that metric on the front end in order to promote people up within the system that actually believe in this change in the culture?
I can actually answer some of this. Well, again, if we're talking about traffic safety and saving lives, I mean, you can actually measure reduction in fatalities, reduction in crash injuries yearly. There's even new data systems out that can capture hot spots in cities and jurisdictions to notify where potentially dangerous intersections or roadways are. Right, so For law enforcement, then that just means, maybe it's not how many traffic stops did you do this month, but how many lives did we save this month compared to last year? What was the reduction in fatalities, right? And that's something that you can measure.
And I just want to add one thing too. I mean, it's not to say that all traffic stops are bad, because if you're enforcing for impaired driving, DWI, speeding, especially like in those residential neighborhoods, it really saves lives. And then careless, reckless driving, those things actually matter. And so I think one thing to think about is, the messaging about shifting those resources. If you're going to do traffic enforcement, those are the things, those are public safety traffic stops. The non-public safety traffic stops are the things like something dangling from your rear view window, one busted tail light, one headlight out, cracked windshield, excessive muffler noise, those equipment types of violations. And I think those are the messages that I think if we, I think it's more of a leadership thing, quite frankly. If the chief says this is where we want to go, then I think those things can actually happen.
Yeah, and just to echo that point, just focusing on dangerous drivers, dangerous driving behaviors, those things that John points out, belts, booze, and speed. I mean, every year impaired driving kills, is responsible for 30% of all fatalities on the roadways. People who drive drunk also more likely to speed and not wear their seatbelts. So you can, tackle and address much of fatalities just by simply focusing on impaired driving or by speeding, speed enforcement.
Okay, I'm jumping in on you, and I apologize, but not really. Well, don't I catch the DUI? Because don't DUI drivers never turn their headlights on? So this is how I know that person's DUI. It's one of the indicators that I know it's a DUI, so that's how I get good DUI arrests.
Well, former law enforcement, not just an outsider here, so,
We're adopting you for today. Whether you like it or not, you're in.
They're going to display, impaired driving behaviors. That driver, you observe that taillight out, okay, but then you get behind them and now you observe that they're swerving in the roadway, right? So now you start beginning your impaired driving investigation as a result of that, and that broken taillight now becomes sort of secondary.
And I'll say too, how we train on our policy is basically use common sense. This is actually a safety hazard. If somebody is speeding with no headlights on at night, that is actually a safety hazard. Somebody could hit them, they could hit somebody else. That is very different than someone's had a cracked taillight for 3 months, or someone has one headlight out, or somebody, so it's really getting them to critically think about what is actually a safety issue.
Okay, and not to belabor this, right? But everybody knows that the car driving with just one headlight is mistaken for a motorcycle. It's got to be a million times a year on our roadways, right? And the crash occurs because I think I'm just passing a motorcycle. I'm actually passing a large vehicle.
So this did come up actually when we.
I know it's come up.
And what we did again is the data. We could not find one single accident that.
Well, not one single. Wait a minute. Are you sure?
There was not one accident when we looked at our traffic crashes that was because of one headlight at night. And Washtenaw County isn't as big as some of the huge cities, but we were able to really look at the traffic accidents and figure out if we barred stops, would these accidents be more likely to occur? And what we found in Washtenaw is they have gone down by 3%, so traffic crashes have not gone up, while traffic stops overall have decreased by 50%. And so I think it's worth really understanding that.
Yeah, when you look at crash data and nationally, it's like less than 1% of reported crashes involved like an equipment defect, right? So it's almost always something else besides a defective equipment.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you to you all, especially the two on the ends, all three of you. AAA is hugely important, but no, truly, because this is my colleague Tia, I'm Debbie, we're from Maryland, and we've been working for the last 2 years to pass safer traffic stops legislation in Maryland and have gotten almost to the finish line. We've got the FOP not opposing us. We have the Attorney General not opposing us and even supporting it. And we really can't get it over the edge because we have individual prosecutors who will come and individual sheriffs who will come and say, somebody will be killed because the headlight's out. So first of all, I want to thank you for your vision, because if you are not changing this from the inside, you are saving lives. So you should be so proud of what you're doing. And second of all, I guess, yeah, you truly are. Maybe we're coming at this all wrong because we're doing statewide legislation. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room who are working on statewide legislation. Can I see? Yes, yeah. So maybe the trick is doing what you do, is convincing the single local law enforcement jurisdiction to eliminate it. And I'm going to put you on the spot because I know that John has offered and has met with us and has helped us, but setting up meetings with individual law enforcement leaders with you all to sit down and get the courage to do the thing that they're afraid of doing, I think might make a difference. And so you can think about whether you're all willing to do that. But those are the meetings I think we need to be taking on from here versus the individual legislator, and I'm hoping you would consider that.
Yeah, you know, in Minnesota, we have not successfully been able to pass statewide legislation. Part of that is because of the state, just greater Minnesota metro, there's that kind of divide, and I think greater Minnesota doesn't want this change. But I think the strategy of actually starting locally can actually work too. And so we had that hard conversation in Ramsey County, and we were able to make that change together. Now today, I don't think that there is a police chief in my jurisdiction of those 9 that will publicly oppose what it is that we're doing. And in fact, they take advantage of the alternative. So they take advantage of the lights on coupon and all of those things. And then now Hennepin County has done, the prosecutor at least has now done the same thing. And so it's spreading. So I think another strategy is, if it's not working at the state level, maybe getting the local police chiefs. And keep in mind, policing is owned by who? The people. And so a conversation with city council members, mayors who oversee the policing that's happening in your community, and then engaging that police chief in the story about just how your office, your officers, your agency will benefit over the long run in terms of enhancing what is so critical to policing, which is community trust. And at the end of the day, I think deliver a better quality of safety and justice for the people.
Good morning. In my experience, law enforcement, this is primarily a question for the sheriff, law enforcement respond to incentives, right? And so you were entering an environment where incentives were, right, and production of statistics, stop data. How do you change that? How did you change that culture? How did you change the incentive structure? Meaning, what's the goal of most officers, right? They want to get promoted. They want to get the overtime shift. They want to get, right? There's a whole host of things that we incentivize. I heard a story from a police chief once, just as an example. It was a small thing. And, you know, he told me that somebody found the drugs in the car that Chris talked about. And back in the locker room, right, a lot of attaboys, they put out a monthly newsletter. It's the front page of the newsletter, right? Officer so-and-so nabbed the drugs. And what it created was an incentive structure, subconsciously in some cases, to have officers want to be that person. They want to be the person in the locker room. They want to be the person on the front page of the newsletter. And so we create these incentive structures. How do you go from, in a traditional agency, maybe patrol to sergeant, sergeant to lieutenant, right? The incentive structure is often driven by productivity. And so you came in and you changed the way they were doing business, but I wonder if you could tie that into how you may have changed the incentive structure. What is now being incentivized?
That's a really good question. So one of the things that we did is we now measure their community engagement the same way we would measure anything else. And so when they go hang out at a park for a community event or go to a local church, we basically, through the dispatch system, we're able to track that, and then we're able to give kudos based off of that. You know, your community engagement numbers have increased this month. Great job getting out there. The other thing that we do is we do a lot of positive accommodations and incentives around the things that we want to see. So, when they think critically about how to solve a problem, one example is we have this neighborhood where young people are driving mopeds and they will not stop, and it's causing adults in the community to raise just war. They're mad. And so we have some deputies that are working with local bike shops to see if they can get them e-bikes donated. This is also an area that's significantly in poverty, because then it would be less loud, so the noise won't be as an issue, and then they could do bike safety work. So that is what we are trying to incentivize. And so what I have told my staff is, I do not want you all to just be responding and answering calls for service. You all are smart. You all are most of them are just starting their careers. I need you guys to be problem solvers, be critical thinkers, because if we can get all the police in a community to be really trying to think through how to stop problems and improve safety without just thinking about the tools they have on their belt, it's huge. That's a lot of people that are always driving around in a community that are now working to solve those problems. So it's a lot of that positive incentive structure. We do award ceremonies where we try to highlight the good things they're doing, saving lives, naloxone saves, things like that. Where it's hard, I have found, is with the sergeants, because we are now expecting frontline supervisors to completely supervise differently. And so we have had to spend a significant amount of time talking to the sergeants so they really understand, because upper admin can say one thing, but then if the sergeants are then doing something completely opposite, then you'll have that disconnect as well.
Over here. Go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you so much. So following that same vein, I'm looking more in terms of accountability. So I do criminal appeals, and you can have a situation where we represent a client, the case goes up to the appellate court or the Supreme Court, and you will have a panel of judges says, this traffic stop was unconstitutional. And in one of my cases, there was even a 2-page essay about how some of the judges are distrustful about RIN and pretextual traffic stops and how it affects the community. Now, when that decision comes out, obviously I know about that case, the Attorney General knows about the case, my client knows about that case, but the individual officers, I don't know ever gets that opinion. I don't understand if they ever get the feedback to say, hey, what you did on this day at this time violated somebody's rights and they lost years of their life in prison because of it. And in one of my particular cases recently, whereas it went to the Maryland Supreme Court, the officers who was found to have done this unconstitutional traffic stop was given a promotion. So I'm wondering, how do you, or have you, or do you provide that level of feedback and accountability by saying, hey, what you did created this type of ruling? And if not, how do you suggest that we provide that feedback to law enforcement?
I'll look at the attorney, but what I will say at Washtenaw, we work closely with the prosecutor, so we are at least putting those legal updates out, because another big problem is how often are you even giving legal updates, right? So when something changes because of case law or something happens, do they get that information? And the attorney probably can also speak to this.
Well, first of all, Wren, which is the controlling Supreme Court case, makes it completely legal to pull people over for the purpose of conducting a secondary investigation. So if you see somebody with a traffic violation, you can pull them over just because you don't have to have probable cause. You just think. In fact, the Philando Castile case, the officer thought that maybe Philando Castile was the robber of a convenience store 2 days prior because he had a wide set nose. He wrote that in his police report. He had no business pulling him over for that hunch, but he came up with one after he followed him for about a quarter of a mile and realized that the middle brake light was out. So what we need to recognize is that the Constitution is the floor. There is nothing wrong with the leaders in this room to advocate for a higher version of rights for our citizens. So we can go beyond Wren. So I think the key is for the people that actually have the power in our communities, especially around law enforcement, to tell the people who do the policing that we actually are going to increase the level of constitutional protection for the people, and we're not going to live down at the floor, and that's the policy for policing. No, the policy can be more than what the Constitution allows.
Okay, stand up here for a minute. Oh boy. You believe in the war on drugs, don't you? You don't mind if I search you tonight? You don't have any drugs on you, do you? No, you don't have a gun, do you?
I don't consent.
Brother, what's your... No, serious. I mean, you're good. This is cool, right? We're all right.
Not cool, not cool.
That's not right? Didn't he give me consent? No, he didn't, but... Yeah, no, I'll let you sit down. I only picked on him because I... Informed consent is an interesting, that I'm just going to toss out in the room because I've got several people waiting in line. But does that really hinder our ability if you actually know that you can say no to me tonight and I can't use it against you? Is it, again, a hindrance to the well-being of law enforcement, or is it an enhancement of what we do?
Oh, you want someone to answer?
Okay, hello. Hi, Brittany Francis with People's Council. We serve survivors of police violence in Houston, Texas. We've been a part of a coalition of community groups fighting for non-safety traffic stop reform. And we've made a lot of progress because Houston's a driving city and residents understand the public health impact of being stopped every single time you drive because you're black or brown or your car is in disrepair. But we've gotten some champions at City Council who are interested in working on this. We're trying to do this at the local level. But the barriers we've run into is with the Houston Police Officers Union. And I'd say the two central problems are a callousness to the impact this has on Houston residents. The HPOU president recently said, comply now, complain later, after years of public testimony about the harm this is causing. And then the second problem we're seeing is a total resistance to the data. The data shows, we have city-level data showing that these stops are not making our roads safer, but at least HPOU leadership is insisting that this is an important tool in the law enforcement tool belt, that these stops allow them to investigate drug crime, gang involvement. Officers will sit outside of house parties and run license plates and say, you know, if I wasn't allowed to do this kind of traffic enforcement, I couldn't do my other work. So this is an important step towards, you know, resolving the more serious issues in the community. How would you recommend we grapple with this callousness, with this resistance to the data?
So one thing that I would suggest would be that I think that other law enforcement agencies who have made this change and can see the benefits, to try to figure out a way to connect those jurisdictions to the people in Houston, especially that law enforcement community. We benefited greatly by engaging Harold Metlock, the former chief of Fayetteville, who back in 2013 made an extraordinary change. He showed up to work and said, we're not doing this anymore. And there's a whole story behind why he said we're not doing this anymore, but it actually worked. And you could see the data about how the disparities changed, how the numbers went down in terms of that type of enforcement, but more importantly, the crime also plummeted at the exact same time. We have that same story and experience in Ramsey County, Minnesota. So if you just Google Ramsey County decreasing non-public safety traffic stops, we've kind of created a toolkit, actually, and we're working with the National Policing Institute as well. But there's videos of testimonials from our police chiefs talking about how this has actually made their community safer. We're building more trust, how gun recoveries are actually going up, how crime is going down. All of those things we've been able to document. But I really think that the key to the change, sometimes I think when the police feel like this is something being done to them, there's going to be that resistance. And I think that it's a part of changing hearts and minds. And so it's a long conversation. And I think part of that strategy should be trying to engage other law enforcement leaders from across the country. In fact, I know that our St. Paul police chief has spoken with the folks in Houston. just to share our story. So hopefully that, as more jurisdictions are making this change, it could be documented about what kind of good is coming out of them. I think that's a great strategy in terms of trying to make this change more sustainable and long-term.
I would echo that. Scarlett, you mentioned this during our last Traffic Safety for All call, just like, what can we do? And I said, we got to get law enforcement that do this to speak up about it. It can't come from the outsiders, because it's got to come from the insiders. I was just at Lifesavers Conference. Anybody familiar with Lifesavers Conference? There's nobody speaking about this issue there. And there's law enforcement represented there. And that's a traffic safety conference, a national one, the biggest one in the country. So, we've got to get people who do this speaking out in places where law enforcement are. I used to be an academic studying policing, and, I would doubt that there's maybe a few panels across the criminology conferences about this too. So I would encourage people who do research on this to be at those conferences presenting their research about this as well.
So we've got a couple more questions over here. I know lots of hands going up. We may take a minute more, Scarlett, if you're not. Okay. One of the things I want to toss out, because this is a smart room, is not federal immigration enforcement causing crime to go down in the city. And this is talking correlation, causation. When we start talking about, well, there's less incidents of violence, there's less crashes because of the way we're handling traffic stops. Well, right, conversely, isn't there less of that because of the wonderful immigration enforcement that's taking place in the country right now? Just something to hang out there as you think about how do you meet the challenge, right? Because again, talking to like-minded people is easy. Talking to someone who completely disagrees with you and thinks opposite is a challenge. And how do we come up with that? Because if somebody's got the answer to that, I'm hiring you. I don't know what we're going to call ourselves, but I'm hiring you. Please.
Thank you. My ally, Brittany, had asked this question, but I did want to just, we're also doing similar work in Houston, and we've met with the police chiefs as well. So one, I would like to invite all of you panelists to come speak to our police chief to let them know and educate them, as well as the sheriff. But I did want to add that one thing that did caught me and really blew a fuse when we were talking to the police chief is that they said this was an issue of perception. How would we combat that issue as well, and getting them to believe the data that we present? I know you answered this already, but I just wanted to add that portion because that did really bother me when I spoke to them.
So I'll just say really quickly about the data, because we see that law enforcement are so skeptical of it's a culture, right? They're very skeptical of academics, of data. And what I think has been most helpful is the what's in it for me. And so what we started talking with folks about that we have seen is the mental health and wellness piece in law enforcement is so tied to the same systemic classism and racism embedded in policing. In fact, the average age of life for police is the same average age of life for those most policed in Washtenaw County. And that means that the issues are deeply interconnected. And so finding a way, whether it's through the union or others, to tie in, this is hurting you too. This is causing you to be hypervigilant, and you're always looking for someone doing something wrong, driving around. This is causing you to be more stressed. We had a deputy that was severely injured on a stop. So officers have been injured by traffic stops as well and killed. And so really finding a way to tie it to that wellness component for them. And then the rank and file, they get in trouble at times. And a lot of police chiefs and sheriffs don't like admitting this across the country, but it's true. They will get lectured and in trouble if they're not producing enough. And so they don't want to get in trouble because they're not making enough stops when they just went call to call to call. And so there's that component too, where like we tied it to not only are we going to stop low-level safety related, non-safety related enforcement, we are also going to ban evaluation and discipline based on how many stops or tickets the officers are writing. And so that was that what's in it for me.
If I could just add one thing too, I think building out an alternative for the naysayers is really important. So the people are going to be like, well, you just want me to ignore that? Or the public will say, then do I have to pay my license tabs anymore? So maybe working with a foundation to get an alternative to be put in place where you could notify people of the defect, the equipment defect, and then just letting them know that they need to fix it. If you could find the funding to have a voucher to help people pay for that equipment violation. We went to our foundation community, and there was interest there to make that happen. So we created a Ramsey County Public Safety Fund. But I bet you there's philanthropy in the Houston area that would embrace that. And then I think you can go to your police departments and talk about building out an alternative system that does not require people being pulled over for these types of violations.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. My name is Eliana Machevsky, and I'm an attorney at the National Police Accountability Project. Sheriff Dyer, you talked about this a little bit, about pushback from smaller communities that were contracting with your office's services, being concerned about a drop in funds that would come from traffic enforcement. And I know that a lot of traffic tickets that are given out during traffic stops are unpaid and turn into warrants. And so I'm not even sure how much money is really being extracted to go back into the city or to go into the police department. But we're litigating a case in a very small town in Mississippi where the entire police budget comes from extracting fines and fees from Black motorists who are stopped for non-safety violations, and that's encouraged from the board of aldermen of the town, and we know that this happened in Ferguson as well. And just curious to hear, in addition to data that you have on decreases in kind of racial disparities in stops and no decrease in public safety that you've had with your change in policy, do you also have any data on whether the county is losing money, or if something to respond to that pushback that might come from both the police department, the sheriff's office, and city leaders?
So there absolutely is a revenue component. We have not received pushback based off of any lack of revenue. It's been more so, what are they doing? We want to see them out in the community. Are they being productive? But you know what I will say is, we learned during the pandemic across the country that if you are sustaining your budget on traffic enforcement, it's not sustainable. Eventually, we will get to a point in this country where we totally revolutionize how people get to and from, right? And so if there is an addiction to this fine and fees at local levels, we got to figure out a better way to structure. And so I would say, if pushback happens there, I think the problem isn't that the problem is this is systemically created to stay afloat in this way, to where maybe it's getting the state actors involved. Can there be more state funding that goes to local municipalities so they don't have to supplement their budgets based on this? Because that is a real problem, and it's not sustainable. And so I think it's really important that we look at how local government is structured and funded, because that could absolutely be a huge part of it. I think the contract partners just aren't telling me that, if that's a problem for them. But so far we haven't heard any specific revenue arguments. It's more so been the productivity arguments.
So let me just make a comment on revenue, and then I'll pass it on to the next question. If you look at officers fully loaded, so I'm not just talking about their salary, I'm talking about the cost of training, the gas, everything that goes into it, the cost of printing the tickets, the cost of paying the judge, the cost of having the officer go to court, the cost of a hearing, right, processing it, mail fees, everything else. Cities across the country lose money on tickets. They don't make money, right? So this notion that they're paying for the police service because of this is really not realistic, especially when you consider motorcycle officers, which carry more insurance. They have boots, they have specialized equipment, helmets. Motorcycles are outrageously expensive to keep up. Right? So your fully loaded cost in order to write that ticket is much more than you're ever gaining in revenue. So you're expending more money in order to write that ticket than you are creating revenue for your police department. I'm going to go here and then I'll come up to Scarlett.
Hi, Courtney Williams-Golo. I'm from AMSA. I'm actually glad because you've just said something, because it's been on my mind this entire conversation about trying to convince people based on the tangible, when the other side of this is that we are a society that really is funded and run on the intangible social capital of fear. We've talked about immigration enforcement, we've talked about informed consent, and how the intersection and like the junction of all these things are actually keeping these things alive. And so, you know, there are a few people in this room who look like me and my family, and the idea of informed consent and the idea of compliance is based on fear. It's based on the idea that you have to. And so the loopholes that we're teaching both sides of these sort of parties, that you can push this informed consent, but you also have to comply because it might be your life. And the idea of this social capital of fear being like, people are not coming outside because they don't feel safe. This idea that public safety and the idea of safety is entirely rooted in this concept and rooted in fear. It's not about happiness, what makes it feel better, but what is scary. And we have small communities that are entirely driven by the fear of something else, the fear of otherness. And so the idea of policing from the start, the switch over from Jim Crow and Reconstruction, is entirely rooted in fear. And so what do we do about this intangible feeling of policing? We're talking about convincing people about cost revenues down, you know, better outcomes, you know, disparities, but we're really not talking about what are we doing about the use of fear as the social capital that allows these issues to persist.
I'll just say, for me, I think it goes to harm reduction. So stopping unnecessary contact, right? If you don't, and really trying to explain to police officers, because it's easy for them to forget how they make people feel. And I'm guilty of it. I mean, back when I was policing and I would sit at the park and eating a burrito, and I get 2 calls from the neighborhood, like, what's happening? Is everything okay? And, you know, just my presence and sitting at the park has caused this stress and this fear. And I think the way, at least for me, how I look at it is it's harm reduction. It's making sure that my staff are minimizing harm wherever they can. Compassion is a value that we have. It's trying to get them to understand that the way that they carry themselves and the way that they show up in the community should not be based off of these very rigid, sort of outdated and largely problematic principles that you have to be this occupying force in a community. You should be a part of the community. But I think that we have a long way to go as society. I feel like policing isn't just a profession, it's America, right? People police each other, right? And getting people to see that real public safety is much bigger than that. It's health, it's being able to thrive, it's caring about each other, it's not being suspicious of each other. That is when we figure that out, I think we'll be in a much better place. I think we're on the right track. It's going to take a long time. And so from the lens that I operate in, I always look at it as, how am I teaching the folks that work in our communities in law enforcement that when they show up in the community, they should do so through a lens of compassion and harm reduction. And I don't know if, in each of our professions, it looks much differently. So.
Yeah, for us, it's, understanding a safe system approach. So for us, it's understanding we're not going to arrest our way out of a problem like this. If it's traffic safety, it's getting, public health department involved. It's DOTs, roadway designers, engineers, bringing everybody to the table to bring about public safety, right? So that's, how we approach it.
Your question is really good. And we all, and I'm very guilty of this, fall into the trap of legitimizing and humanizing a system that was not created to be humane. And it's a profession that I spent 25 years in and 10 years afterwards still working to improve it. But we get into, how am I going to get this through that one court case? How am I going to convince this audience that this is what it is? And it really is about our lack of humanity, and it's where we should have started, right? How do we bring humanity to a system that just really wasn't interested in being humane? And so thank you very much. I'm going to give Scarlett the last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
It doesn't have to be a question, just a food for thought, as Chris has been doing so well. But something that is coming to my mind when you said we need to present an alternative with the equipment violations. Okay, yes, there needs to be an alternative. Here's a voucher. That kind of makes it go down easier. I think we need to present an alternative for the crime detection function, quote unquote, that law enforcement are clinging to, that it, from my understanding, is a relic of decades ago, from like the pre-internet era. And we have completely different ways of finding and detecting serious crime and of, more importantly, addressing violence and, you know, systemic problems in our community. And we need to be able to articulate what we're asking for. And that's really hard, and we're not going to answer it right now. But when you come to Houston, maybe that can be part of the, like, shaming a little bit of like, y'all are doing policing that's like really outdated and you need to be doing this kind of policing. But we can wrap it up for now and keep the conversation going. We're going to have a break until 10:45, and then we're going to have our next panel. And then after that is lunch, so fear not. Thank you all.
Thank you.